You believe the greatest horror in a hospital is death. That is the first lie they teach you. The comforting falsehood, whispered to keep the panic at bay. They want you to think the enemy is a flat line on a monitor, a final clinical breath. But I have walked the echoing halls in my visions. I have seen the shadows that cling to the curtains, and I know the truth. The real horror is not the ending of life, but the residue it leaves behind. The echoes of pain, the stains of fear that soak into the very walls, until the building itself develops a consciousness, a hunger. Death is a merciful release. What lingers there is something far, far older, and infinitely more patient. It watches from just beyond the reflection in the polished steel. It listens in the hiss of the oxygen tank, and it waits for the vulnerable, the weak, for the moment you are caught between worlds. These are not mere stories. To call them that is to insult the echoes of the souls trapped within them. These are fragments of a shattered mirror, and each piece reflects a truth too terrible for the waking world to accept. We will journey together into these places, these sterile temples of suffering where the veil between our reality and the ABS is worn thin, shredded by the sheer weight of human misery. You will hear the whispers of nurses who saw more than they were ever meant to, the final words of patients speaking to someone who wasn't there, and the creak of doors opening into rooms that have been empty for a decade. Prepare yourself. What we are about to uncover is not meant for the light of day. It is a secret written in dried blood on the back of a forgotten death certificate, a warning scrawled by a trembling hand. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Our first descent takes us into the suffocating quiet of a pediatric ward after midnight. The air in these places is different, heavy with a mixture of antiseptic and unspoken prayers. A young nurse, let's call her Clara, was making her rounds, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum, a ghost in her own right. She moved past rooms filled with the gentle, rhythmic breathing of sleeping children, a fragile piece she was tasked to protect. But as she neared the end of the hall, she felt it, a drop in temperature so sudden it felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. The air grew thick, still, and the cheerful cartoon animals painted on the walls seemed to sneer, their smiles becoming predatory in the dim emergency lighting. She clutched the cold metal of her chart, a useless ward against the UN scene. She stopped before room 413, a room that had been empty for weeks, awaiting a deep cleaning that never seemed to come. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness gaping like a wound. From within, she heard a sound that froze the marrow in her bones. It was the faint, unmistakable sound of a child's laughter. Not the joyful sound of a playground, but a hollow, cold giggle that seemed to echo from a great distance, like a memory replaying itself. Clara's training, her logic, her entire sense of reality screamed at her to turn back, to dismiss it as the hum of a machine or a sound from another floor. But a deeper, more primal instinct, the one that recognizes the presence of something wrong, held her paralyzed. She knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that she was not alone in that hallway. Her hand, trembling, pushed the door to room 413 open. The darkness within seemed to drink the light from the hallway, a void that was absolute. The giggle had stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt louder than any sound. The room was bare, a single small bed with a stripped mattress, a nightstand and a window looking out into the blackness of the city. But the cold was emanating from the corner of the room, a palpable presence that made her teeth chatter. And in that corner, for just a fraction of a second, she saw it. A small dark shape, no bigger than a 5-year-old child, huddled against the wall. It wasn't a shadow cast by the light. It was a patch of deeper darkness, a hole in the fabric of the room. It had no features, no clothes, just a pure, silent presence, a presence of immense sorrow. The shape, It uncoiled. It didn't stand up like a person, but rather it seemed to flow upwards, a column of living shadow. Clara didn't scream. The sound was trapped in her throat, a knot of pure terror. She could feel its attention on her, an ancient and lonely gaze that pierced through her, seeing every fear she had ever harbored. The laughter she had heard was not of joy, but of a terrible, unending loneliness. The sound a soul makes when it has forgotten it was ever human. The entity drifted, not walked, towards the bed, its form wavering like heat haze. It reached out a wispy, indistinct hand and touched the barren mattress. At its touch, the mattress visibly sagged, as if under the weight of a physical body. The cold in the room intensified, and Clara could see her own breath pluming in the air, a fleeting white ghost. She finally found the strength to move, stumbling backward, her hand fumbling for the doorframe. As her fingers brushed against the cool metal, she heard a new sound, a whisper that wasn't carried on the air but bloomed directly inside her mind. It was a single pleading word, "Mommy." The voice was not of a child from our world. It was thin, reedy, stretched across an eternity of waiting. It was the sound of a broken cross, of hope turned to rust. Clara fled. She ran down the hall, the sound of her own frantic heartbeat, drowning out everything else. She didn't stop until she was in the bright, sterile sanctuary of the nurses' station, surrounded by her colleagues, who saw the blood drained from her face and the stark terror in her eyes. She never spoke of the shape, but she refused, for the rest of her career, to ever walk that hallway alone again. She knew what lurked there, a memory, an echo so powerful it had gained a semblance of life, forever waiting for a mother who would never return. Now we travel to a different kind of darkness, the organized chaos of an emergency room. This is the modern charnel house, a place where life and death are decided in moments, under the cold, indifferent glare of fluorescent lights. An experienced paramedic, David, brought in a patient from a horrific car crash. The man was mangled, his life pouring out onto the gurney like spilled wine. David and the trauma team worked furiously, a desperate ballet of scalpels, clamps, and shouted commands. But it was no use. The man's heart gave out, the monitor screaming a single unbroken note that announced his departure. The time of death was called, the team fell silent, and a sheet was pulled over the man's face. David, exhausted and splattered with a stranger's blood, stepped back to catch his breath. But the truth is, the departure was not clean. As the orderlies came to take the body to the morgue, a strange thing happened. The room, which had been a cacophony of noise moments before, became eerily silent. The hum of the machines seemed to fade, the chatter from the hallway outside, muffled as if by a thick fog. David watched as they moved the gurney, and as it passed him, the sheet covering the dead man's body began to move. It wasn't a twitch or a spasm. It was a slow, deliberate rise, as if the corpse beneath was taking a deep, shuddering breath. The orderlies froze, their faces masks of disbelief. The sheet continued to rise, forming a taut peak over the man's chest, holding there for an impossibly long second before collapsing back down. David felt a cold dread wash over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in 20 years of dealing with death. He'd seen death in every conceivable form, but he had never seen it mocked like this. The senior doctor, a man of pure science and logic, strode over, his face a thundercloud of annoyance. He ripped the sheet back, ready to berate the orderlies for their hesitation. But what lay on the gurney silenced him. The dead man's eyes were wide open. They were not the glazed, unfocused eyes of the recently deceased. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a terrifying awareness. And they were staring directly at David. The man's lips, blue and bloodless, peeled back from his teeth into a ghastly, impossible grin. It was not a human expression. It was a rictus of pure malice. Then, the body began to speak. The voice that came from its throat was not the man's. It was a chorus of voices, a layered, dissonant sound of whispers and groans, like a radio tuned between stations of the dead. It spoke a language that was not of this earth, guttural and ancient, words that seemed to scratch at the inside of David's skull. The doctor stumbled back, his scientific certainty shattered into a million pieces. The orderlies were gone, having fled in silent terror. Only David remained, pinned in place by that malevolent stare. He felt as if the creature wearing the dead man's skin was sifting through his memories, his fears, his deepest regrets. It knew him. It had been waiting for him. The whispering voice from beyond filled his mind, not with words, but with images of broken things, of final lonely moments, of cold, empty rooms. What the stars don't tell you openly is that some souls don't just leave, they are evicted. Something else takes up residence in the moments after the final breath, a cosmic scavenger that slips through the cracks when the door between worlds is left ajar. The thing on the gurney continued to grin, its dead eyes boring into David, promising him an eternity of that cold, whispering darkness. It was only when a new trauma case was wheeled in, the chaos of life shattering the unnatural silence, that the spell was broken. David blinked, and the body on the gurney was just a body again. The eyes were closed, the mouth slack, but the grin was etched into his memory, a brand on his soul. He never told anyone what he truly saw. How could he? How could he explain that for 30 seconds? He stood face to face with something that had crawled up from the AB West to wear a dead man's flesh like a borrowed coat. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Let us now creep into the forgotten wings of an old asylum, a place later converted into a long-term care facility. The walls here are saturated with a history of despair, every peeling layer of paint covering a scream. A young orderly, Michael, was tasked with the night shift in the hospital's oldest section, a place the other staff avoided. They called it the Whispering Wing. The patients here were mostly catatonic, lost in the labyrinth of their own minds. Michael's job was simple: make his rounds, ensure everyone was breathing, and try not to listen too closely to the sounds the old building made as it settled. But the building wasn't just settling, it was remembering, and its memories were not pleasant. One night, while walking the dimly lit corridor, Michael heard a faint scratching sound. It was coming from room 237, a room that had been sealed for over 50 years. The official story was structural damage, but the old-timers whispered of a patient who had practiced dark arts, a woman who had clawed her own eyes out, claiming they showed her things from other worlds. The scratching was rhythmic, insistent. It sounded like fingernails on the other side of the heavy wooden door, a desperate, maddening sound that scraped at his nerves. He pressed his ear to the cold wood, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scratching stopped. It was replaced by a whisper, a dry, sibilant sound that seemed to seep through the wood itself. It said, "I know you're out there. Let me see you." Michael recoiled as if burned. The voice was ancient, filled with the dust of decades. He tried to rationalize it. A draft, the pipes, his own imagination running wild in the oppressive silence. But the whisper had been too clear, too personal. He shone his flashlight on the door. It was thick, solid oak, with a small reinforced glass window at eye level, painted black from the inside. As his light beam played over the window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A long, thin scratch appeared in the black paint from the inside, then another. Something in that room was clawing away the paint, trying to look out. He was watching a dead woman, a woman who had been gone for half a century, trying to scrape her way back into the world. He stood mesmerized by a horrifying fascination, unable to tear his eyes away as more and more of the black paint was flaked away by the unseen nails. A small, clear patch of glass was slowly being revealed. Michael knew he should run, that he should sound an alarm, but he was rooted to the spot. He had to know what was on the other side. What kind of ghost had the physical power to do this? The scratching stopped. A perfect small circle of glass was now clear. He leaned in, his breath fogging the window on his side. He peered into the pitch blackness of the sealed room, expecting to see something. An eye, a face, a shape in the dark. Instead, he saw nothing but his own terrified reflection in the glass. He let out a shaky breath of relief. It was his mind, just his mind. And this is where everything changes for you. As he stared at his reflection, another face slowly faded into view behind his own. It was a woman's face, pale and gaunt, with long, stringy black hair. But it was her eyes, or rather, the lack of them. Where her eyes should have been were two gaping, black sockets, pits of endless night that seemed to pull him in. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharpened, filed teeth. The reflection of the woman wasn't in the room behind the glass. It was superimposed over his own, sharing the same space, looking out of the window with him. The whisper came again, this time not from the door, but from inside his own head, a cold voice that echoed in the empty chambers of his soul. "Now I can see," Michael finally screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore through the silence of the wing. He fled, leaving the door to room 237 with its newly cleared peephole, a window now open for something ancient and blind to gaze out upon the world of the living. Our journey now takes us to the sterile, cold heart of a hospital, the morgue. This is the final stop, the antechamber to oblivion. It is a place built on the foundation of silence and finality. A junior pathologist named Elias was working late, performing an autopsy on a John Doe, a man who had been found in a river with no identification. The body was cold, bloated, and unremarkable, just another sad end to a forgotten story. Elias worked with detached professionalism, his instruments making small, precise sounds in the quiet room. He dictated his findings into a small recorder, his voice a calm monotone against the hum of the refrigeration units. The body lay on the steel table under a harsh white light, a slab of meat to be catalogued. As Elias was finishing up, preparing to suture the body closed, he noticed something odd. A tattoo on the man's wrist, previously obscured by water damage and grime, was now becoming clearer under the heat of the lamp. It wasn't a skull or a cross or any typical design. It was a strange, intricate symbol, a spiraling sigil that seemed to pulse with a faint, dark energy. It was a mark he had seen before in the forbidden books. His grandfather, a man obsessed with the occult, had kept locked away. It was a sigil of binding, a mark used to trap an entity, a spirit, a demon, within a physical vessel. His scientific mind rebelled, but a cold finger of dread traced its way down his spine. He leaned closer, a morbid curiosity overriding his fear. Suddenly, the refrigeration units, which had been humming steadily all night, sputtered and died. The morgue was plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. The only light was the single intense lamp directly over the corpse. In the sudden quiet, Elias heard a sound. It was coming from the John Doe. His eyes shot to the man's chest, which was still open, his organs exposed and examined. The sound came again, a horrible liquid whisper. Elias watched, frozen in a state of clinical disbelief, as the corpse's lips, chapped and gray, began to move. They formed a word, a single guttural syllable that Elias recognized from his grandfather's books. It was a name, the name of the entity bound by the sigil. The moment the name was spoken, the air in the morgue grew impossibly heavy. thick with the smell of river mud, and something else, something ancient and foul, like decay and ozone. The overhead light began to flicker violently, casting the room in a stroboscopic nightmare. In the flashing light, the corpse on the table seemed to writhe, its limbs twitching with an unnatural life. The sigil on its wrist began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. Elias understood with a clarity that was both insane and undeniable. The man hadn't just drowned, he was a prison, and the autopsy, the opening of the flesh, had weakened the bars. The prisoner was trying to get out. He was standing in a room with a cage made of flesh, and he had just been handed the key. The corpse's head lolled to the side, its dead eyes fixing on him. A voice, not from the lips, but from the gaping cavity in its chest, spoke to him. It was a voice of gravel and dried blood, a voice that promised power, knowledge, and an end to all his mortal fears. It offered him secrets that drove lesser men mad. Elias scrambled backward, knocking over a tray of instruments with a deafening crash. The entity laughed, a sound like grinding stone that echoed in the silent morgue. It was testing him, tempting him. All he had to do was erase the sigil, break the final lock. He could feel the power radiating from the corpse, a dark, magnetic pull that promised everything he had ever desired. It was a whisper from beyond, offering a pact written in cold ashes and sealed with a final damning breath. He ran, leaving the body on the table, the light flickering, and the whispers of the prisoner echoing in the cold, dead air. We now move from the dead to the newly born, to the seemingly hopeful environment of a maternity ward. But even here, where life begins, shadows can gather. A nurse named Sarah worked the night shift, a time of profound quiet punctuated by the occasional cry of a newborn. She loved her job, the sense of being present at the very beginning of a new story. One night, a woman was brought in who was in premature labor. She was frantic, disoriented, and kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "He's not mine. He's not mine." The staff chalked it up to delirium and pain, sedating her lightly as they prepared for an emergency C-section. Sarah was there to receive the baby, a small, fragile boy who, despite his premature arrival, seemed perfectly healthy. The baby was placed in an incubator in the neonatal intensive care unit, a room filled with the soft beeps and whirs of life-sustaining technology. Sarah was assigned to watch over him. The first few hours were normal, but as the night deepened and the hospital fell into its slumber, a change occurred. The other babies in the unit, who had been sleeping peacefully, began to stir and cry, one after the other, a chain reaction of distress. But the new baby remained silent, utterly, unnervingly silent. He lay in his incubator, his eyes wide open, not with the unfocused gaze of a newborn, but with a clear, sharp intelligence. His eyes, a shade of blue so dark they were almost black, darted around the room, watching the other infants cry with what looked like amusement. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She approached the incubator, her reflection a pale, worried ghost in the plastic shield. The baby's dark eyes snapped to hers, and he held her gaze. It felt like looking into the eyes of an old man, an ancient soul trapped in a tiny new body. As she watched, a smile spread across his tiny face. It was not the gassy, reflexive smile of an infant. It was a knowing, conscious, and deeply unsettling grin. It was the same kind of malicious grin David the paramedic had seen on the face of the dead man. A shiver of pure primal dread went through her. The other babies were now screaming, a chorus of pure terror, as if they could sense something profoundly wrong in the room with them. Then, the machines connected to the new baby began to act erratically. His heart rate, which had been stable, dropped to a dangerously low level, then shot up to an impossible high, all without any change in his calm, smiling demeanor. The alarms should have been blaring, but they remained silent. Sarah watched the monitors, her medical training screaming that this was impossible, a malfunction, but she knew it wasn't. She was witnessing a deliberate act of manipulation. The child in the incubator was controlling the machines, playing with them, demonstrating its power. The mother's words echoed in her mind. "He's not mine." What had she meant? What had she seen? What had she given birth to? Listen carefully, because this is crucial. The boundary between worlds is thinnest, not just at death, but at birth. A new vessel arrives, empty and open, and sometimes something else rushes in to fill the void before the intended soul can take its seat. The baby in the incubator turned his attention from Sarah to the infant in the next incubator, a little girl with a weak heart. His smile widened, and as he watched her, the girl's heart monitor began to flash red, her vitals plummeting. He was feeding on her fear, on her weakness, a tiny, perfect predator in a sterile cage. Sarah, acting on pure instinct, threw a blanket over his incubator, breaking his line of sight. Instantly, the girl's monitor stabilized. The crying in the room subsided. When Sarah removed the blanket, the baby was sleeping peacefully, looking as innocent as any other newborn. But she knew what she had seen. A changeling, a whisper from the other side, wrapped in the flesh of a human child. Our next tale unfolds in the lonely quiet of a hospital's on-call room. A small, windowless space where exhausted doctors try to steal a few moments of rest. Dr. Alistair Finch, a surgeon known for his steady hands and unshakable skepticism, had just finished a grueling 18-hour shift. He collapsed onto the narrow bed, the smell of antiseptic clinging to his scrubs. He fell asleep instantly, a deep, dreamless slumber. He was awoken sometime later by a persistent, gentle tapping sound. It wasn't coming from the door or the hallway. It sounded like it was coming from the wall right next to his head. Annoyed, he assumed it was the plumbing, the groans of an old building. He rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but the tapping continued, growing more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It began to form a rhythm, a pattern that was too deliberate to be random. It was a code. Alistair sat up, now fully awake, a knot of irritation and unease tightening in his stomach. He was a man of science, of observable facts. Ghosts and spirits were the domain of the desperate and the deluded. He pressed his ear against the cold, painted wall. The tapping was clearer now, and it was undeniably coming from within the wall. It was the distinct sharp rap of a fingernail on drywall. He knocked back, a hard, sharp rap with his knuckles. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sounding absurdly loud in the small room. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Alistair began to feel foolish. It had to be a colleague playing a prank, or perhaps a patient in the adjacent room. He lay back down, his skepticism reasserting itself like a shield. Then, a voice whispered from the wall, so close it sounded as if the speaker's lips were pressed against his ear from the other side. It was a woman's voice, weak and filled with a breathless urgency. "Doctor," it rasped, "you have to help me. I can't breathe." Alistair shot out of bed, his heart pounding. The room was empty. The voice had been as real as his own. He knew the layout of the hospital. The room on the other side of that wall wasn't a patient's room. It was a decommissioned elevator shaft, sealed up during renovations 30 years ago. The voice came again, more desperate this time, a horrible, wet, gasping sound. "He left me in here. The doors won't open. Please, doctor. It's so dark." A cold realization washed over Alistair. He remembered the stories, the hospital legends whispered by nurses during long night shifts. The story of a young nurse who had an affair with a jealous surgeon in the 1980s. She had vanished without a trace, presumed to have run away. Her name was Eleanor. The surgeon, a man who had retired in disgrace years later, had been the one to oversee the renovations, the one who had insisted that particular elevator shaft be permanently sealed. The tapping started again, weaker now, more frantic. It was the sound of a woman, trapped in the dark for 3 decades, clawing at the walls of her own tomb. Now, imagine this. You are a man of logic, a man who believes only in what you can see and touch, and you are listening to the ghost of a murdered woman who is trapped in the wall a few inches from your face. The whispers grew fainter, dissolving into a sound of ragged, painful breathing, then a final shuddering sigh that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room, and then silence, a silence more profound and terrifying than the sounds that had preceded it. Alistair stood in the middle of the room, shaking, his entire worldview fractured. He had spent his life fighting death, but he had just come face to face with the undeniable proof that death is not an ending, but merely a change of address. He knew, with absolute certainty, that every night, when an exhausted doctor lay down in that room, Eleanor woke up and began to tap, forever reliving her final suffocating moments. Let us now descend into the labyrinthine basement of a century-old sanatorium, a place where the air is thick with the ghosts of archaic and brutal treatments. In the modern era, this basement housed the hospital's vast archives, a maze of shelves holding the paper records of every patient who had ever passed through its doors. A young archivist named Leo was hired to digitize these records, a lonely and tedious job. He spent his days surrounded by the silent, dusty histories of thousands of lives, the air smelling of old paper and decay. The only sounds were the hum of his scanner and the scuttling of unseen things in the walls. He often felt watched, a persistent prickling on the back of his neck, but he dismissed it as a side effect of the isolation and the oppressive atmosphere. One afternoon, while searching for a specific file from the 1920s, he ventured into a section of the archives that was rarely visited, a dead-end corridor of towering metal shelves. As he ran his finger along the faded spines of the folders, he came across one that was different from the rest. It was bound in cracking black leather, with no name or date on the spine. It felt cold to the touch, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to leach the warmth from his hand. Curiosity overriding his unease, he pulled the heavy volume from the shelf. It wasn't a patient file. It was a journal, filled with the cramped, spidery handwriting of a doctor who had worked at the sanatorium during its earliest, most experimental days. His name was Dr. Aldous Blackwood. Leo sat on the floor, the dim basement light barely illuminating the yellowed pages. As he began to read, a story of profound horror unfolded. Dr. Blackwood was not a healer. He was a monster who cloaked his sadism in the language of medical science. He believed that the human soul could be cured of its imperfections through extreme physical and psychological torment. The journal was a meticulous, detailed record of his treatments, which were nothing short of torture. He wrote of isolation chambers where patients were left in absolute darkness and silence for months, of hydrotherapy sessions using scalding and freezing water, and of surgical procedures performed without anesthetic to burn away the madness. He described his patients not as people, but as vessels, as raw material for his grotesque experiments. But it was the final entries that turned Leo's blood to ice. Dr. Blackwood wrote of his ultimate experiment, a procedure he called the severance. He believed he could surgically remove the part of the soul that harbored darkness, fear, anger, despair. He selected his most resilient patient, a woman named Annalise, who had been admitted for melancholia. He described the procedure in horrific graphic detail, a butchery of both body and spirit. But something went wrong. According to the journal, as he made the final incision, Annalise had laughed, a sound he described as the cracking of a broken mirror. He wrote that he had not removed her darkness, but had instead cut the tether that bound it to her humanity. He had set it free. The final entry was scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand. Blackwood wrote that the thing he had unleashed from Annalise was now haunting the sanatorium. He could hear it whispering from the walls, see its shape in the corner of his eye. He described it as a being of pure shadow and rage, a cacophony of pain given form. He wrote that it was hunting him, that it remembered the feel of his knife. The last words in the journal were, "It is in the room with me now. It wears her smile." As Leo read those words, he heard a sound from the end of the dark corridor, a soft feminine laugh, a sound like cracking glass. A cold draft snaked around his ankles, and the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling began to flicker. He had not just found a record of the past, he had awakened it. The darkness Dr. Blackwood had unleashed had never left. It had simply been waiting, in the silence and the dust, for someone to read its story and remember its name. We now turn our gaze to a place of quiet desperation, the oncology ward. This is where the long, slow battles are fought, a place where hope is a flickering candle against a hurricane of despair. A palliative care nurse, Eleanor, had a patient named Mr. Gable, an old man riddled with cancer, who was in his final days. He was a kind, gentle soul who rarely complained, but in his last few weeks, he became terrified of falling asleep. He would fight it with all his remaining strength, his eyes wide with fear. When Eleanor would ask him why, he would whisper about the man in the corner. He described him as a tall, thin figure, dressed in an old-fashioned dark suit, who would appear in the corner of his room as soon as he closed his eyes. Eleanor, compassionate but pragmatic, assumed the man was a hallucination, a common side effect of the powerful narcotics he was on. She would reassure Mr. Gable, sit with him, hold his hand, and tell him he was safe. But the old man's terror was palpable and real. He claimed the man never spoke, never moved, but simply stood there and watched him, waiting. He said the man's face was always in shadow, a deep, impenetrable darkness that seemed to absorb the light. Eleanor would turn on all the lights in the room, show Mr. Gable the empty corner, but as soon as she left, his fear would return. He was convinced the man was not a product of his mind, but a visitor from somewhere else, a collector. One night, Eleanor was at the nurse's station when Mr. Gable's call light came on, flashing frantically. She rushed to his room to find him sitting bolt upright in bed, a feat of strength he shouldn't have possessed. His eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of death. "He's here," the old man rasped, his voice a dry rattle. "He's not waiting anymore." Eleanor followed his gaze. The corner was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight. "There's no one there, Mr. Gable," she said softly, her voice a practiced calm. "You're safe." The old man shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. "You can't see him," he whispered. "But I can. He's tipping his hat." Eleanor felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, a wave of cold that raised goosebumps on her arms. The air in the room grew heavy and still. She looked back at the empty corner, and for a fleeting instant, she thought she saw the darkness in that corner deepen, coalesce, take on a shape that was taller and straighter than a simple shadow. It was an optical illusion, a trick of the light in her tired mind, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. Mr. Gable let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of resignation, and his body went limp, his head falling back against the pillow. His fight was over. The man in the corner had finally made his move. What the stars don't tell you openly is that the reapers of this world do not always carry scythes. Sometimes they wear suits and stand patiently in the corners of rooms, visible only to those whose feet are already touching the other side. As Eleanor confirmed that Mr. Gable had passed, she reached to close his eyes. It was then she noticed something on his nightstand that hadn't been there before. It was a single black crow's feather. It was lying perfectly straight, a stark, dark line against the white surface. She had cleaned the nightstand herself not an hour earlier. There was no way it could have gotten there. It was a token, a calling card left behind. She knew, in that moment, that Mr. Gable's visitor had been very, very real. A silent, dapper gentleman who came to escort the dying. A shadow that walks the halls where death is a constant, unwelcome resident. Let's move now to the psychiatric ward, a place where the distinction between the mind's horrors and external ones is forever blurred. This is a place of locked doors and shattered realities. A young psychiatrist, Dr. Eris Thorne, was treating a new patient, a woman known only as Jane Doe. She had been found wandering the streets, catatonic, her eyes vacant. She would not speak, eat, or respond to any stimuli. She would simply sit and stare at a blank wall, her hands clenched into tight fists. Eris tried every conventional method, therapy, medication, gentle prompting, but nothing could break through the wall she had built around herself. She was a complete mystery, a human statue locked in a silent world. One evening, Eris was reviewing Jane's case in his office, frustrated by the lack of progress. As he stared at her photograph, a thought struck him. Her hands. She always kept them clenched. He wondered what she might be holding on to, either real or imagined. The next day he sat with her, not speaking, but simply waiting. After an hour of silence, he gently reached out and touched her clenched fist. "What are you holding, Jane?" he asked softly. For the first time since her arrival, she reacted. Her head snapped toward him, her vacant eyes suddenly focusing on him with a terrifying intensity. Her knuckles were white, her grip impossibly strong. She began to rock back and forth, a low, guttural moan emanating from her throat. Her eyes darted around the room, not seeing him, but seeing something else, something only she could perceive. "He gave it to me," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "He said I have to hold it. If I let go, he'll get out." Eris felt a professional curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread. Who, Jane? Who will get out? She leaned in close, her breath cold and foul. "The man in the reflection," she hissed. "He lives in the mirrors. He's not me. He wears my face, but he's not me. He wants to trade places. This," she said, her grip on her own hand tightening, "is the key to his cage. As long as I hold it, he stays on his side." Eris, ever the rationalist, saw this as a breakthrough, a classic delusion. The key was a psychological construct, a way for her to maintain control in a world she felt had none. He decided to try a gentle form of exposure therapy. He had a small shatterproof mirror brought into the room. The moment Jane saw it, she began to scream, a high, piercing sound of pure agony. She thrashed against her restraints, her eyes fixed on her own reflection. "He's there. He's smiling," she shrieked. Eris looked at the mirror. He saw only her terrified, contorted face reflected back. "There is no one there but you, Jane," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Look, it's just a reflection." And this is where the line between madness and reality dissolves into cold ashes. To prove his point, Eris stepped in front of Jane, blocking her view of the mirror. He looked at his own reflection. It was normal. His tired, concerned face stared back at him. "See," he said, turning to her. But Jane wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the mirror behind him, her face a mask of ultimate horror. Her jaw was slack, her eyes wide. "He's behind you," she whispered. Eris turned back to the mirror, and for a split second, a single, heart-stopping moment, his reflection was not his own. It was a man with his face, but the eyes were black, empty pits, and the mouth was stretched into a wide, predatory grin. The reflection raised a hand and waved at him, a slow, deliberate gesture. Then it was gone, and his own shocked face was staring back. In that moment, he understood. Jane wasn't delusional. She was a gatekeeper, and he had just rattled the cage of the thing she held captive, a creature that lived in the world of cracked mirrors and wanted desperately to cross over. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Our final story for this gathering comes from the place where all hospital stories eventually end, the laundry. Deep in the sub-basement, amidst the roar of industrial washers and the thick, humid air, a man named Hector worked the night shift alone. It was a monotonous, thankless job, sorting through the soiled linens of the sick and the dying. The sheets and gowns arrived in large canvas bins, often stained with blood, sweat, and other effluvia of human suffering. Hector was a stoic man, not easily spooked, but even he would admit that the laundry room at 3 a.m. had an unsettling quality. The hiss of the steam presses sounded like whispers, and the shadows thrown by the single rows of lights played tricks on the eyes. One night, a bin came down from the surgical ward that felt different. It was heavy, and it gave off a palpable aura of cold. Hector sighed, assuming it was just soaked with more bodily fluids than usual. He untied the canvas flap and began to pull out the blood-soaked green sheets. As he got halfway down, his hand touched something that wasn't linen. It was cold, hard, and sharp. He pulled it out. It was a scalpel, crusted with dried blood. It must have been accidentally wrapped up in the sheets after a surgery. It was a dangerous oversight, but not unheard of. He set it aside and continued working, but the feeling of unease lingered. The bin of laundry felt wrong. As he reached the bottom of the bin, he found the source of the weight. It wasn't just linens. Wrapped in the final sheet was a collection of objects that had no business being there. More surgical tools, clamps, scissors, a rib spreader, all caked in dried blood. But there were other things as well. A handful of human teeth, a lock of black hair tied with a red ribbon, and a small hand-carved figurine of a man, with pins stuck into its heart and eyes. It was the paraphernalia of some dark folk magic, a curse. Hector felt a wave of nausea. Someone hadn't just been performing surgery, they had been performing a ritual. Suddenly, the main door to the laundry room, a heavy steel door that was always propped open, slammed shut with a deafening bang that echoed through the vast room. The lock clicked shut. Hector was trapped. The roaring of the washers died down one by one, their cycles ending, plunging the room into a heavy, humming silence. The only sound was the drip of water from a leaky pipe, each drop landing with the finality of a closing coffin lid. Hector called out, his voice sounding small and weak in the cavernous space. There was no answer. He was alone, or so he thought. From the far end of the room, hidden among the shadows of the silent machines, he heard a soft, wet, shuffling sound. It was the sound of bare feet on a damp concrete floor. Shuffling, dragging, coming closer. Hector grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox, his knuckles white. The shuffling grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural breathing, a sound of immense effort and pain. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, dressed in a tattered surgical gown. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide and staring. But they weren't focused on Hector. They were focused on the bin of laundry, on the ritual items he had just uncovered. The man's chest was a mess of crude, stitched together incisions, a grotesque mockery of a surgeon's work. He was the patient from the ritual, or what was left of him. The figure shuffled forward, its arms outstretched, its fingers twitching. It wasn't hostile. It seemed lost, confused, drawn to the pieces of himself left in the bin. Hector realized this was not a man. It was an echo, a psychic residue left behind by an act of such profound violence and dark intent that it had stained the very fabric of the hospital. The ritual had not just killed the man, it had torn his soul into pieces, binding him to the objects of his own demise. The figure reached the bin and began to rummage through it with a desperate, pathetic urgency, its guttural moans now sounding like sobs. It was a ghost, not of a person, but of a desecration, a soul so thoroughly shattered that all it could do was endlessly try to put itself back together again. Hector stood, wrench in hand, a witness to a horror far beyond death, the eternal, restless damnation of a soul that can never be made whole. We have walked the shadowed corridors together, peered into the rooms where the lights have been turned off, and listened to the whispers that the living were never meant to hear. You came seeking stories, but what you have found are warnings. You have seen that a hospital is not merely a place of healing, but a monument to pain, a library where every book is bound in human skin and written in blood. The echoes of suffering do not simply fade away. They congeal, they fester, they gain a semblance of consciousness in the dark, forgotten corners. They become the giggling child in the empty room, the grinning corpse on the gurney, the tapping hand within the wall. These places are wounds on the face of the world, and they do not heal cleanly. Do not mistake the sterile white walls for purity. They are a canvas, and upon them, the darkest emotions of humanity are painted in colors you cannot see, but you can feel. The next time you find yourself in such a place, listen. Listen past the beeping machines and the quiet footsteps of the nurses. Listen for the whispers in the ventilation, for the sound of a door creaking open when no one is there, for the sudden chill in the air that has no earthly source. You may think you are safe, surrounded by science and medicine, but the oldest sickness is not of the body, but of the soul, and the entities that are drawn to it have no cure. They are patient, and they are always waiting for the veil to thin. Remember the stories you have heard tonight. Let them be a splinter in your mind, a shadow at the edge of your vision. They are a testament to the fact that there are cracks in our reality, and in places of great suffering, those cracks widen into gaping maws. The things that slip through are not always content to remain unseen. They are drawn to the living, to the warmth, to the light. They are a constant, silent presence, watching from the cracked mirrors in the dark corners. The true horror is not that these things exist, but that they exist side by side with us, separated only by our own fragile belief that they do not. That belief is now broken. Sleep well if you can. The darkness is listening, and it remembers your name.